Picture this. You're wealthy beyond measure, a powerful figure on Wall Street. You're considered an American hero. The world is at your fingertips. Now imagine you have a massive failure so big people credit it as starting a global depression. I learned about Jay Cooke and his failure with the Northern Pacific Railroad. When I wrote my blog about Jay Cooke and his failed railroad venture, I said that studying financial crises throughout history is a lot like studying wars. There are far too many of them, and each feels unique. I still believe that because I can't really think of a better metaphor than what I came up with. I'm going to stick with it. So I will continue to use my own analogy when I say that the global depression of the 1870s feels a lot like World War One. Each was outshined by a later event, World War II for World War One, and the Great Depression for the depression of the 1870s. Plus, while each was a very complicated event that had many reasons for happening, people generally attribute one event to the start. For World War One, it was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and for the global depression of the 1870s, it was Jay Cooke's financial collapse and his failed railroad. Now, this episode isn't about the global depression of the 1870s. It's not even really about the Panic of 1873. No, it's about Cook's big failure and why he gets blamed for starting everything. Cook isn't Charlie Brown always missing the football, and he really isn't even a typical investor looking to get into the railroad industry. He was probably one of the most powerful men and definitely one of the most powerful bankers in the United States in the 19th century. I would compare him to someone like Warren Buffett, someone of that wealth and that influence. There's something very unique about him. He was considered to be the financier of the Civil War. I mean, that's a title. When the Union needed funds, they wanted to issue bonds. However, they weren't that successful at it. The government struggled to sell the required amount, so they went to Jay Cooke. They were a little hesitant at first, but eventually they knew they had to go to Jay Cooke. And he raised nearly 1.5 billion in bonds for the Union. That was almost a quarter of all the funds raised. A quarter is a lot. Probably really helped the Union out. Again, it's hard to give a fair comparison because you could take someone like Warren Buffett, but you have to make him an American hero. And I think that's tough to do today. It's just not the way the world sees it. And in this case, an American hero not directly through war or politics, but through the operations of his business. Very fascinating way to go about things. And he was just a tremendous man in that regard. But really, this episode is about his failed railroad and how it helped lead to the Panic of 1873. If you're wondering why the Panic of 1873 and the global depression of the 1870s is important, well, just from an American standpoint, it led to a lot of significant political overhauls, which had a major impact on Reconstruction. For anyone who doesn't know, Reconstruction was a time in America after the Civil War when the country tried to put itself back together. One of the foremost Reconstruction historians, Eric Foner, really goes into the fact that the Depression of the 1870s mattered because it changed what the voters were focused on and had a big impact on who got elected. Who knows what America would be like had the Depression not changed these voting habits? Originally, Cook was hesitant to get into the railroad business, specifically the Northern Pacific Railroad, specifically Pacific. See, I could say it quickly. I got talent. He turned down the idea when officials first approached him right after the Civil War in 1866. However, when 1870 came around, Cook started thinking, maybe. This change can be for a few reasons. First, the Transcontinental Railroad had just been built, and people loved it. We still talk about the achievement. Maybe he was influenced by cementing his legacy and creating something. Maybe he wanted to be a great man who created something like the Transcontinental Railroad. Or maybe he just wanted a lot of money. I think Cook always liked a lot of money. So, like Homer Simpson after seeing The Empire Strikes Back, I'm going to give a big spoiler. The reason the Northern Pacific Railroad bankrupted Jay Cooke was that he kept having to pour money into the venture. The railroad ran into tons of issues and bond sales were low. So Cook kept putting good money in after bad. What I mean by that is the money's already lost and he just keeps spending more and more. In business, they call it the sunk cost fallacy. For example, a person finds out that their car needs $5,000 worth of work and the car is only going to be worth $2,000. But because they just put $2,000 in the car, they feel like they need to invest the extra $5,000. Not worth it. Again, good money after bad. They should just cut their losses. But Cook wouldn't. He just kept throwing his money in. You're probably asking yourself, what were the issues? At least I hope you're asking yourself that because that's pretty much the focus of this episode. Well, the issues were land and people. Pretty common sense. When you build a railroad, you need good land for smooth construction, and you need someone to be able to handle that construction, someone with skill. If you have good land with bad people, it would be a struggle. If you have great people on not so great land, it would be a struggle. If both are subpar, you're in a lot of trouble. Jay Cooke had both against him. So that's wonderful. At first glance, one of the major routes through Minnesota should have been great for building a train. Most of its land is relatively level. But, as historian M. John Lubkin points out, Cook couldn't have picked an area with more issues. To quote Lubkin, for over 100 miles, the area consisted of porous glacial moraine with lakes, swamps, peat bogs, sloughs, pine barrens, sinkholes, quicksand, and sometimes floating islands of solid ground. Beside visible creeks and rivers, underground streams flowed just below what appeared to be firm land. Essentially, not a good place to be building a train. Making it all worse is something that I think everyone hates, and that would be mosquitoes, a good summer night's arch nemesis. The standing water in the area produced a ton of mosquitoes. There would literally be mosquito clouds that would result in dead animals and suffering workers. I can't imagine. You're working hard at building this train, you're sweating, it's not a fun day, and then a cloud of mosquitoes attacks you. I don't know how they handled it. And then that's days of tortures afterwards where you're just itching away. Plus, that cloud killed animals like horses, delaying the work. Also, how the heck do they focus on anything? Wouldn't they be on the constant lookout for mosquito clouds? I would be. Plus, once it leaves, you will be like an old man yelling at a cloud. I never before thought of mosquito clouds, but I'm fairly certain it's a new fear of mine. A large part of railroad construction, which I learned in reading about this, is surveying the land for track. You don't just go like, hey, we're going to build here because we want to. You have to know the land, you have to find suitable land, you have to make sure it's all right ahead of time. In the 1870s, while it wasn't unexplored land, it wouldn't be like today where you could pop up a Google map or whatever. This is relatively unmapped land, so surveyors had a lot of work to do when they went to go out and map it. However, this is also the 1870s in the Midwest. There were increasing tensions between the United States and the Native Americans, which really made surveying a problematic task. Native Americans were pretty much rightly concerned that as the United States moved west, they would slowly lose their land. I think that's a fair worry, all things considered. So Native Americans fought back, which slowed down the surveyors. The surveyors had army units that were sent to protect them, and they clashed with the Lakota Sioux. Making things worse for Cook is that these battles with the Native Americans made their way east, and often by the time they arrived, they became highly exaggerated. These exaggerated tales scared away investors. They feared that the prospect of investing their money in an area with such high violence was too risky. Their reluctance to invest further harmed the financial position of the railroad and Cook. And now I want to do a quick aside because in the course of researching this topic, I came across something that I love about history. That is learning that two stories intersect in ways you had no idea about. One of the men sent to protect the Northern Pacific surveyors was Major General George Custer. While protecting the surveyors in the Dakota Territory, Custer and his men met their tragic end. So, if the Northern Pacific Railroad did not try to go through the Dakota Territory, Custer may not have become famous for his defeat. Now, I need to be fair to Cook. Custer's defeat happened in 1876, and Jay Cooke lost control of the railroad in 1873. Also, who knows if the Custer's defeat still happens if Jay Cooke hires far better people and experiences far fewer delays. That's a huge what if, but fun to think about. Still, the stories of Custer and Cook tie together because of the Northern Pacific. I love when history ties things together. So, let's review the land issue. Construction took longer and cost more because the land they chose was way more problematic than they thought and had far more obstacles. Surveying was extremely delayed since they had to move at a slow pace because of the battles with the Native Americans. And because of those battles, Cook struggled to get new investors. They got scared away. I said before, if land was Cook's only issue, it likely would have been a struggle, but he would have survived. However, he just did not hire the right guys for the job. Cook was such a successful financier, you might think he knew how to hire people. Railroad construction, though, is its own animal. He just did not hire the right people for the job. Cook placed J. Gregory Smith at the head of Northern Pacific. Smith was a businessman and former governor of Vermont. And I'm going to say this a few times. Smith was not the right man for the job. Smith had recently run his company, Vermont Central, a railroad company, into the ground. And there were some thoughts that he may have been misusing the company's resources. Yeah. Now here's the thing. I don't know if Cook knew that Smith was stealing from his company. Or should I say being accused of misusing their funds? Do I still need to say allegedly if it's over 100 years ago? That's a good question. Anyway, back to Cook and Smith. I would think that Cook did not know what Smith was accused of. Though while Cook might not have known that Smith was misusing funds, he should have known that Smith was not the guy to run this company. Lufkin pretty much lays it out that Smith had never done large-scale railroad construction before. His former company, Vermont Central Railroad, had slow growth. That's not what the Northern Pacific needed. The Northern Pacific needed rapid growth. That's how it was going to get built. That's how it was going to pay back its investors. It had to happen, and it had to happen fast. So Smith didn't have the experience. Can I say it? Smith was not the right man for the job. Maybe you're asking yourself, how does a railroad getting built sustain itself and make money? Maybe you weren't asking yourself. You just assumed investors kept paying into it. But I'm going to assume you asked yourself, and now I'm going to answer. One of the means for income is the railroad sells land around the railroad to settlers. People really weren't living in these areas because there was nothing there, but now there'd be railroad stops. It would give them a chance to connect the potential new towns to others. Perfect. Mass transit. However, in order to sell that land, you need to certify it. To be more precise, Smith had to certify it, and Northern Pacific did not certify a single acre of land in 1871 or 1872 because Smith and his management, he just kept delaying the process. These delays cost the company, really cost Cooke, millions. Don't worry, Smith was incompetent in a lot of ways. On top of not certifying the land, he also decided that the railway needed 51 first-class Baldwin locomotives, when they had already purchased 48 regular locomotives. Listen, if I'm on a train, I want to ride first class. Sure, I've never been on first class on a train or had a train ride that would require it, but I'm assuming that's where I want to be. However, if I'm building a train and we're not moving at the right pace and we're not making money, I think I'm going to stick with regular locomotives and not buying a bunch of new first class ones. I'm fairly certain you could always buy first class trains later. And so, one last time for good measure, Smith was not the right man for the job. Making it all worse was that the board seems to be on board with Smith and all of his requests. They just kept approving everything he wanted, which made it worse. However, Cooke did finally manage to remove Smith in late 1872. But the board wasn't going to let Smith go without making things worse. Not on their watch. So since the board was split on Smith's replacement, the Northern Pacific Railroad went without someone in charge for 4 months. It was not the right board for the job. The last person to mention is someone that wasn't involved in the Northern Pacific Railroad. Rather, he was an employee at Jay Cooke and Company, which was Jay Cooke's investment firm. His name is Harry C. Fahnestock. What a name. Fahnestock ran the New York office of Jay Cooke and Company and owned 14% of the bank. He was against Cooke investing so much of his money into the venture. A generous reason for that might be that he thought Cooke was going to bring down the firm by investing all of his money on the railroad. But some of what I read said there might be another reason Fahnestock was against Cooke's plans, and that's that he had fallen into J.P. Morgan's orbit. J.P. Morgan is a legendary financial figure. I mean, super powerful. He helped define banking and paved the way for much of how banking turned out in the 20th century. He was a rival of Cooke's, which shows you how far Cooke fell. Most people can name J.P. Morgan. I'm not sure how many people can name Jay Cooke. I don't know if I could really before I read all this. So the fact that they were rivals at this point and Cooke was absolutely on par with Morgan, especially with that whole financier of the Civil War, shows how far this event brought Cooke down. But anyway, Morgan had an influence on Fahnestock, and Morgan basically could only make Fahnestock think less of Cooke. You add in the fact that Fahnestock wanted to maintain his personal fortune, and you get a man willing to turn on his employer. It led to him closing the Newark branch of the Jay Cooke Company on September 18, 1873. Fahnestock gave Cooke no chance to salvage the situation. Objectively, Jay Cooke's finances were not great at the time, but he had enough skill, enough friends, he probably could have been able to save the New York office, or at least had a fair shot at it. Fahnestock knew that and gave him no chance. The closing of the New York office doomed the bank. There were global economic issues already occurring in 1873, but it had yet to develop into a full-blown panic. However, once Jay Cooke and Company closed, suddenly people freaked out. If you're wondering how Jay Cooke and Company closing could lead to such a panic, the 2008 financial crisis might prove to be a good comparison. 2008 global economies were struggling. They were showing tons of distress. But when Bear Stearns was looking at bankruptcy, everyone panicked. So you just put Jay Cooke and Company in the Bear Stearns role. You know, there was a lot of things going on in 1873 that showed the economy was in trouble, but people only realized how bad it was once the first domino fell. The domino, of course, being Jay Cooke and Company. In a move that shocked no one, J.P. Morgan stepped up and took advantage of the void created by the removal of Cooke. It was perfect for him. His greatest rival's gone, bang, he takes advantage of it right away. Fahnestock was on the outside looking in as Morgan capitalized on Cooke's downfall. However, he did land on his feet as he eventually became president of First National Bank for about 25 years. He also has a great name, Fahnestock. Along with his bank, Cooke had to declare personal bankruptcy, which had to hurt. Put yourself in his shoes. You're the financier of the Civil War. Now you're claiming bankruptcy. I mean, that really has to hurt. The notice to the creditors shows that Cooke had about 81,000 between two mortgages, but that's in the 1870s, so the value would be slightly over 2 million today. Cooke moved in with his daughter after the bankruptcy procedure. There is a bit of a happy ending to the Cooke story. Cooke did regain some of his fortune, but just never to his previous levels. So cheers for the guy being rich again, I guess. More importantly, the Northern Pacific was completed in 1883, which didn't help Jay Cooke at all, but at least all the effort to get there wasn't wasted. So that's Cooke's big failure. I think it's unlikely that had the Northern Pacific been successful enough that Cooke didn't need to declare bankruptcy, that it would have changed much globally. I could be wrong. It just seems that the world was trending towards depression. It seems all Cooke did was blow the whistle to start the game. That's it. As I said, I didn't know much about Jay Cooke going into this, but I found it fascinating. How man this successful, this much going for him, had one failed venture. Now he's credited with leading it to a global depression. The story has what I love about history, about learning about one person and how it can lead to so many places. Learning about Jay Cooke took me to the Civil War, Reconstruction, a global depression, and Custer's defeat. Jay Cooke's story ties into so many places. I would encourage anyone to go read my sources in the description. Please go read about Jay Cooke, about the railroad, about Reconstruction, about the Panic of 1873, all that. It's a good time. Of course, I'm a history geek, but then again, you're watching this, so hopefully you are too, and that's really all I got to say for this. So again, like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and thank you very much for tuning in.